Actually, no, I do have a question.
Okay.
And this is part of what I'm working through in the drash, but I think it's given how much we're working off of diagrams, given how much we're referring to diagrams to help make the text intelligible, or to make at least the questions intelligible. And given that the parshiot, particularly in Teruma, actually Truma and Tetzaveh, both have the refrain, like the pattern, like what I showed you, Bahar. The question is, why doesn't a diagram have the status of, the question is why narrative? Because a narrative seems to be a very inefficient and not terribly effective way of giving instructions for building the Mishkan and the Klim, and also for rendering information about the later on the Beit HaMikdash. So, question is, why narrative, and are there texts? Why narrative? Why narrative as opposed to diagrams?
Illustration, yeah.
Illustration.
So my thoughts about this are, I have a couple of approaches. So
I've got a few approaches too. I'm just wondering if this is actually addressed in text.
Say that again.
I'm wondering if in fact Chazal had anything to say about
that. I'm not going to claim to know explicitly, because I'm not well versed enough in all of Chazal to say, but based on what I know from Chazal, so this was one of the approaches. There's a kind of a conceptual approach, which is there's a particular value that is given to not only narrative, in other words, but to writing down using letters and words. Mm-hmm. Torah is the Torah shebichtav is defined by being letters and words and sentences and parshiot and so forth, and that has its own particular status and meaning. So that's one aspect, and the other aspect is the illustration. I would put it this way: Chazal understand from the text, right? Particularly when it says "zeh," right? Like "zeh ma'aseh hamnorah," right? So,
or even going further back, God pointing out the new moon.
Very good. I was going to that was my next example. I think that's the first case it's used in halakha, yes, right? It says a chodesh hazeh lachem, right? So in all these places where it says this, so Chazal say that Kadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe, right? He showed him an image in the sky of what something was supposed to look like. So presumably that image is really part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's really an oral, even though it, like you say, like
it's visual, not oral. It's still part of.
Right. In other words, it's not part of Torah Shebichtav. So even though it's visual, it's technically part of an oral, so let's say oral / visual tradition, and that's distinct from a written tradition. That's a very broad outline of the way I would approach this subject. I'm guessing that historians would say, well, people didn't start illustrating stuff like that until blah, 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 blah.
That's not true.
So first of all, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We know that there are earlier illustrations than the Bible, right? They're even earlier. Again, I'm not an expert, right? This is not my area of expertise at all. But
I remember I worked for a security guard in the Orient Institute in Chicago. I worked as a night watchman in the Oriental Institute.
Oh, the Oriental Institute. Okay.
And basically, I'd be spending all night with these visual representations, different night.
Exactly, right.
Some of which were earlier than, certainly earlier than our codified text.
Yeah. So that idea is but here you could ask, let's say, okay, so what about later? What about in Mishnaic times and Talmudic times? Why didn't they use illustration? And there I don't have an immediate answer. I don't know. We see like the Rambam did illustrate many things in his Perush on the Mishnah and to some degree in the Mishnah Torah.
Is he the first to do that, or are there earlier ones?
I don't know, but in my limited knowledge, I think he may have been the first to do these kinds of illustrations. So he has, let's say, a Masechet Midot, which is pertinent to what we're learning now. He has a lot of illustrations, and it's also clear that the Rambam had he had that kind of background because he had a thorough mathematical background for his age, which was pretty advanced. And so he would have also, he would have seen other kinds of mathematical and geometry texts that would have had, I think, similar illustrations. This is my speculation. This isn't my area of expertise, but that's my guess. The Rambam was pretty careful in his illustrations, given his age. Now we have very sophisticated illustrations that can be computer generated and so forth. You see the illustrations that I refer to sometimes, like those are printed in the back of the Mishnah on Seder Kodshim. And so those illustrations date from like the 19th century, and it also had a certain level of sophistication. One of the things this is a little bit of a digression. One of the things I keep pointing out is that even though those illustrations include a lot of information, they weren't necessarily done to scale in a proper way. If you measure them out, they don't actually always fit to scale. So that's one of the things I've been looking for. I think there is a book now where somebody did them properly. I started to make my own a few years ago, like decades ago. They never followed through. I have a feeling that people could do it much better than me. But anyway, back to your basic question, so why aren't there illustrations in the Torah? I think that's why.
Or even more than that, why is this information rendered in narrative primarily or at all? You're talking about the instructions for building the Mishkan. It's a very, if efficiency, as we understand it, is the goal, and I'm assuming that it's not. This is an absurd way of rendering the information.
Well, I think I would put it a little differently. I will
put it differently in my sure, but yes.
No, okay, but you're right to say so. You can ask this in two ways. You can say, why aren't there illustrations, and why is the information transmitted in a narrative form? So, and each of those actually you can answer separately. They're not exactly the same question. So I think the thing is, in terms of why the information is transmitted in a narrative form, is it comes back to this basic conceptual notion of Torah shebichtav, and we are given the narrative form in order to be able to learn very specific things out from the way things are rendered in narrative form. I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's a very, very interesting question. It's a question that we ask because, we are all used to seeing illustrations. And of course, now if you have any number of printed chumashim, they will have either on the page or in the back, they'll have illustrations for all these things. And it's true, and you talk about Truma and Tetzaveh, where Rashi goes to a great deal of effort to explain in detail the way things look. And he's saying, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's essentially giving it his best guess, which is based on a very careful reading of the narrative in the Chumash and other places in Tanakh. Like, for example, Rashi, like the word ephod. Nobody really knows what an ephod is, right? And Rashi says this, he says, but I think it's this. And he bases that on the context there and the way the word ephod is used elsewhere. And so he's using literary mechanisms in order to try to create the visual. But nobody knows, right? We don't know exactly what an ephod is. And even the other words that we may know what they mean more or less, but we don't know precisely the way any of these things looked. There was a book which I think in my lifetime I've bought 2 or 3 times and somehow it keeps going missing. But there was a book that came out about 50, 60 years ago on the Mishkan, an illustrated book. It's illustrated with photographs. There was a fellow who undertook to recreate to scale a model of the Mishkan and all of the kelim and all the aspects of it. It's a beautifully, beautifully done book. If I remember correctly, I think he was a survivor. And I think this is something that he had promised that he would dedicate himself to if he survived, something like that. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal book. I'm pretty sure it's still in print. And I think he explains, he's basing himself mostly on what Rashi says. And now also we have the Mechon HaMikdash, who are making kelim for the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, their aim is not to make artists' conceptions of what they think the kelim look like. They're making kelim that they expect to use in the Beit HaMikdash. And they're basing that on a lot of halachic discussion throughout the centuries. And I don't know to what degree they do or don't use archaeological evidence, but it's a very serious undertaking. So the idea of like the illustration, but even more so than the illustration, would be the actual rendering, right? In other words, to actually make those things. Why weren't those things handed down? So anyway, I think it raises a lot of interesting questions, and actually it's pertinent also to our discussion in Yoma, because
which is why I'm bringing it up now, as opposed to trying to freeload my.
It is.
I do have my own hypotheses, which I will not throw out now.
Okay, but I'd be very interested to hear them. But those are the things that I think of offhand. In other words, I think the basic thing is that the Torah, the concept of the Torah per se, is this idea of the Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh. There's a specific value to each of them, and that which is not in the Torah shebichtav. The reason I say that the visual would be included, like essentially everything that we know about the Torah shebichtav, that's not in the letters and the words themselves, is all part of Torah shebal peh, which includes the vocalization of the letters and the words, right? That's why we don't write nikud and ta'amim in the Torah, because that's all part of the oral Torah. So there's a specific value that's given to the writing of the Torah. And everything else is also valuable, but it was meant to be part of an oral, let's say, / visual tradition. And one of the things that we talked about a few months ago already, I brought you from the Tosos Yamto's introduction to Masechet Midot, where he quotes the Rambam about, why do we learn Masechet Midot, which is the description of the Second Temple because after all, the third temple isn't going to be precisely the same. And so he talks about this idea that David had received through a divine vision the plans to build the first temple, right? That's referenced in the Pasuk in Divrei HaYamim. And so we understood that each iteration of the Mikdash, beginning with the Mishkan, is going to be specific to its time and to its time. So certain things will remain the same and certain things will be modified. And even though, yes, it would have been helpful perhaps if we'd had illustrations, but by not having illustrations and by not having exact models, that also leaves open that leaves open the possibility, more of the possibility of changes that are given to any given generation to make. I think that's also part of it. And that's also true of the Torah Shebaal Peh, right? Every time we learn, every generation, not within every generation, we are, we're essentially, we're using this approach of the, I don't have a better word for it right now, of the Torah Shebaal Peh in order to learn. And of course, every time we learn, we're adapting the Torah, both the Torah Shebichtav and Torah Shebaal Peh, to our time and our circumstance. So for example, I give this class in English, right? And that's, that in itself, every time we're using a different language, we're giving a particular interpretation that's based on our time and place and our idiom, which happens to be, speaking English mixed with Hebrew and Aramaic and so forth. So that's what I think. I've always thought of it like this: that the Torah Shebichtav is like an anchor. It's like a grounding for everything, but it in and of itself is somewhat inert because it doesn't speak to us. It's not a recording. The only way we know how to say it is because there's an oral tradition that tells us how to read it. And that oral tradition then brings in all of these other things, including what you're talking about. But yeah, I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say about that. It's a very good question. And of course, yes, it's pertinent here to our share for a number of reasons. We only scratched the surface. Okay, so let's begin the shir per se. I didn't mind starting off like that, though. I think that was a very interesting question. Thank you for asking. I wanted to start off today with a couple of references before we get into, go back to the Mishnah that we were looking at. So one of them is, I wanted to give a more explicit answer to a question that came up a couple of weeks ago. I think Paul asked, when we use this term emurim, what does that mean specifically? So I gave this kind of general answer that it's like the innards that are brought onto the Mizbeach. But here the Rambam gives a better answer, of course. And this is in the Rambam in Maaseh HaKorbanot, Perek Aleph Halacha Yud Chet. So he says as follows: Ha'evarim shesorfim otan al gabei hamizbeach min hachataot haneachalot umin ha'ashamot umin hashamim hein hanikrain emurim. All right, so the limbs or the parts of the animal that we burn on top of the altar, in other words, the outer altar, that we get from the korbanot chatat that are eaten, or from the ashamot. And he points this out, chataot and achalot. That's pertinent to what we're learning now, because on Yom Kippur, we have an example of chataot that are nisrafim, that are complete, that are burnt. So they're mostly taken outside of Yerushalayim and burnt. But the chataot that are ne'achalot, in other words, a regular chatat, is slaughtered, and part of it is brought on the mizbeach, and then the meat is eaten by the kohanim. So the parts of the animal that are the parts of the animal that are brought on the mizbeach from chatot that are eaten, or from ashamot, or from shlamim, hein hanikrain emurim. They are called emurim. These are the emurim of an ox or of a goat. The fat that's on the kerev, on the stomach. Right, that includes the fat that's on the stomach. The two kidneys, the fat that's on them. Right, these are all different parts of the innards of the animal. It takes the yoter takaved is this little thing that sticks off of the liver. It looks like a thumb. And if the korban was from sheep, then mosif elu ha'alya tamima. You add on to that the tail, which is a fatty tail. Imachuliyot min hashidra, with the vertebrae from the backbone. Ad mekom haklayot, it goes up to the vertebrae that go up to the kidneys. Shneimar le'emata it he'atzeh yisirena. And all of these are burnt on the outer mizbeach. So that's what's meant by emurim. And emurim, presumably the language of emurim is from the language of like he'emir, which means to give importance to. Hashem he'emircha hayom, right? That it's also related to the word emir, right? It's something that we grant importance to. So that was one thing I wanted to try to clear up, at least to some degree. And then the other thing is, before we go into the shir today, and I have a feeling that this shir is going to extend to next week as well. So we're working on the Mishnah. We have a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about when certain korbanot are brought on Yom Kippur. And we're going to go into that today. And I told you, I think we should look at the Gemara. So I started to prepare the Gemara for that. But I decided before we go into the Gemara, because this is somewhat confusing and I am still working on my chart to try to chart all these things out, I thought, let's start actually with a conclusion. This is a summary from the Rambam that will help us, I think, just to keep in mind the things that we have to deal with. So this is the very beginning of this is the Rambam at the very beginning of Hilchot Avodat Yoma Kippurim, and he says, "B'yom hatzom makrivin tamid b'shachar v'tamid ben ha'arbaim." On the day of the fast, so we bring the tamid that's brought in the morning, right? The eternal sacrifice is brought in the morning, the eternal sacrifice is brought at the end of the day, keseder kol yom v'yom, right? According to the order that they're brought every day. U'makrivin musaf hayom, and we also bring the musaf for the day, par va'ayil v'shiva kvasim, kulam olot, right? We bring an ox and a ram and 7 sheep, and all of them are brought as olot. V'sa'ir chatat naseh b'chutz, there's also a sir chatat, which is one of the musafin. It's called the sir chatat that's done outside, in contrast to what? What's the Sir Hanaseh Bifnim? What's the Sir Hanaseh Bifnim? In other words, we call this the Sir Naseh B'chutz because there's another Sir Chatat that's Naseh Bifnim.
I believe that it's the seer that's brought for, I think the Kohanim, or it's one of the, so it's like a top for some specific subset. I'm grasping it.
Okay, so you gave me your excuse before Shir that you're going to be foggy today. So you're close, but it's not quite on the mark. It's Ken. What? Paul, did you want to say? No, I'm sorry. No, the Sir Hanaseh Bifnim is the Sir La'am Dafka. In other words, in Achrei Mot, so it says that the Kohen has to come with a par and an ayil, and then he also has, and the Am, he has to bring from the Am, he has to bring from the people a seir, right? It's shnei seirim, so one is la'azazel and one is l'chatat, and also an ayil. So the seir la'azazel is not a korban. It's taken outside and pushed off a cliff, as we know. But the other seir, which we also call the seir l'Hashem, we call that the Sir Hanaseh Bifnim because the blood is taken and sprinkled in the Kodesh HaKodeshim and in the Kodesh. And then the rest, then what's left of it after the Emurin is burnt outside of the Beit HaMikdash, outside of Yerushalayim. So that we have it. So on Yom Kippur we have a Sir Hanaseh Bifnim. That's the Sir Chatat for the Am that's mentioned in Achrei Mot, and then in Parshat Pinchas, where it mentions all of the Musafin, we also have a Sir. It also says that we have to bring a Sir Chatat. So Chazal called that, by contrast, the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz. Okay, so that's just to keep track of, help keep track of that. Right, so again, we bring the Musaf of the day, and so we bring the Korbanot Tamid, then we bring the Musaf of the day, which is a par, an ayil, shiva kvasim, and those are olot. Also a Sir Chatat Naseh B'chutz, v'hu ne'achal ha'erev. That's brought as a regular chatat, and the meat is eaten that night. It can be eaten that night. V'od makrivin yetzer al musaf. And in addition, these other things are brought in addition to the musaf. Par ben bekar l'chatat, v'hu nisraf. Right, so that's the par that the Kohen Gadol brings on behalf of himself and the Kohanim. V'ayil la'olah, u'shnehem mishel Kohen Gadol. Right, both of them are brought by the Kohen Gadol. V'ayil haba mishel tzibur. There's also an ayil that's brought from on behalf of the tzibur, from and on behalf of, that's mentioned in Parshat Achrei Mot. V'hu ha'ayil ha'amur b'chumash ha'pekudim bichlal ha'musaf. That's the same ayil that's mentioned in Parshat Pinchas, that's included with the musafin. So we have two elim, right? So when we mentioned this a few times, including last week, when you read Parshat Achrei Mot, it says that the Kohen Gadol has to bring a par and an ayil, and that from the Am, he has to bring two seirim. One lechatat. One of them is actually l'Azazel, and one is to a chatat per se, and also an ayil. And then when you read the Parshat Musafin and Parshat Pinchas, it mentions that there's an ayil that's brought, and we pointed out this is a machloket tanaim. Is that a third ayil, or is it the same as the ayil that was brought on behalf of the Am that's mentioned in Achrei Mot, and the Rambam holds like the Daya that says it's the same ayos. So there are two elim that are brought. Yes.
So that means that you have nowhere in the Chumash an exhaustive list of all the korbanot which you have to bring on Yom Kippur, and the list you really have is a compilation of several places in the Tanakh, which makes the thing very complicated.
Exactly. That's why I'm spending time on this particular issue, because yes, there isn't a list. We pointed this out several times, right? When you read Achrei Mot, it seems to be giving you the order of the day for Yom HaKippurim. But we know from elsewhere in Tanakh, right, from elsewhere in the Torah, that there are other korbanot that have to be brought that day, right? Because you always have a korban tamid. And then in addition, you have the korbanot musaf that are explicitly mentioned later on. So the Torah in Parshat Achrei Mot doesn't give us all of them at once. We're supposed to put them together. But you're correct in saying that it becomes complicated, right? It's confusing, because now we have to understand, okay, so let's say when we take those two, just those two sources, we have Achrei Mot and Parshat Pinchas, and we put them together. So now I have all of the korbanot. But what order am I going to do them in? What's the precise order? And that's where it becomes tricky. And that's what we saw an introduction to a little bit last week. This is very much related to, or it's essentially the basis for the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. There's certain things that they will all agree upon, but there are things that are not so clear. So what we know is from our learning, and from, I'm sure from your own learning, the Korban Tamid is always going to be, the Tamid Shel Shachar will always be the first Korban in the morning, and the Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbaim is always going to be the last Korban in the evening. So those two are fixed. That part is easy. Then the general order of things, I know from Achrei Mot, but how to fit in the order of the Korbanot Musaf with the order that's brought in Achrei Mot, that's where it gets complicated. That's where there's more than one way to understand. So
I'm wondering if this actually can be read. I mean, I'm wondering what happens if in addition to reading this as an instruction of what to do on Yom Kippur with the korbanot on Yom Kippur, we also read this as an instruction for reading. So it seems to me that what this helps do, and in a way that this plays off ideas that I was bringing up in the beginning of this year. Among other things, what this requires, or what this sharpens, is a kind of intertextual reading, a reading that involves paying different passages or different texts off against each other, as opposed to sort of a straight, starting at point A and getting to point B, or even a kind of hypertextual reading, as it were.
Yeah, right, exactly. In other words, there's certain things. I mean, it's just interesting the way that Paul posed the question, because there are places in the Torah where things are more or less laid out in a more straightforward way, and here it's up to us to put it together. We have to put this together ourselves. So why yeah, go ahead.
Yes, but why should this be a machloket Tanaim? Obviously, the Kohanim did have an exact tradition how to do this korbanot, those korbanot.
Okay, so this is a question that we've touched on in different ways from time to time, and I was thinking about it in this particular instance because both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva would have seen avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Akiva was younger, but nonetheless, he was Rabbi Akiva at the time of the destruction. And there is still a machloket. So it raises a question about, is there machloket about what happened in the Beit HaMikdash, or is there machloket a theoretical, and it's based on a halachic theory that regardless of how it was done, this is how it should be done. And I'm going to leave that question hanging, right? Because I think when we finish the sugya, I think I'd like to come back to that question. And it's not that I have a single answer for it. And we've pointed this out many times. There are different places in the Mishnah where we have testimony from Kohanim about this is the way it was done. This is how I saw it done. And that of course carries halachic weight, right? Because it's Maaseh Shahaya, and that reflects a certain tradition. Certain things that were done may also reflect a tradition amongst the Kohanim, which was not necessarily accepted by the Rabbanim. And we have several examples of that as well. If you learn Masechet Shkalim, you'll see there's a couple of examples there. There elsewhere we have that, and also even in Ketubot, right? The Kohanim used to write the Stam Ketubah of a Betula is 200 zuz, it's 200 zuz. But Kohanim, they would write 400 zuz. If it was a Bat Kohen, it would be for 400 zuz. And if I remember correctly, the Mishnah says that Chachamim lo michu biyadam. They didn't object because they didn't want to stir up a machloket with the Kohanim where they didn't deem it necessary. And those are the Kohanim. In other words, I'm not talking about tzadukim, right? In other words, there's a difference, right? Even though many Kohanim were tzadukim, but the tzadukim, that's a whole separate issue, right? So anyway, it's a very interesting question, and for us, as we're learning it, if we're wanting to learn halacha l'maaseh, as it were, what we're saying is, whatever conclusion we'll come to is what we're saying is that when there is a Beit HaMikdash, this is how it will be done. Yesh lomar. Let's continue in this Rambam. Okay, so he talked. So he explained these korbanot, including the elim. V'od mivi'in mishal tzibur shnei seirei. In addition, that we bring from the community at large 2 he-goats. Echad karev chatat v'hu nisraf. One is brought as a chatat, and it's burnt. That's the seir hanaseh bifnim. V'asheni is seir hamishtalech. The second one is the seir that's sent away. That's the seir la'azazel. Nimtzeu kol habehemot hakrevim b'yom zeh 15. So this is the Rambam, who's very good at making these kinds of lists and integrating them. And he says, so based on this, we know that on a Yom Kippur that doesn't fall out on Shabbat, we'll talk about that in a moment, on a regular day, on a Yom Chol, there'll be 15 animals that are brought as korbanot. 2 timidim, par, an ox, shnei elim, 2 rams, v'shiva kvasim, and 7 sheep. All of them are olot. Shnei seir, in other words, all of them, it writes the timidim, the par, the elim, all of the kvasim, those are all olot. They're completely burnt. Ushnei seirim on the mizbeach hachitzon. Ushnei seirim chatat. 2 seirim that are brought as a chatat. Echad naseh bachutz v'nechal la'erev. One of them is done outside, meaning its avodah is done outside of the Beit HaMikdash per se. It's done in the azara. So, and it's brought on the, its blood and its parts are brought on, that are burnt, are brought on the outside altar. V'nechal la'erev. And the meat from it is eaten in the evening. V'asheni naseh bifnim. And the second one is done inside, meaning, as we know, that its blood is sprinkled in the Kodesh HaKodeshim and in the Kodesh, and it's burnt, meaning it's burnt outside of Yerushalayim. Upar Kohen Gadol lechatat, and also the ox that the Kohen Gadol had to bring that was mentioned earlier, that's mentioned now as a chatat. He also has to bring a chatat, and that's burnt, right? So we have the parva seir hanisrafim, which we talked about the last couple of weeks, and all the other korbanot, and so forth. I'm just going to do the next halacha, and then I want to skip to something else. Avodat kol 15 behemot elu hakrevim biyom zeh eina ela b'kohen gadol bilvad. Right, so all of these 15 animals that are brought on this day are done only by the Kohen Gadol. Echad Kohen hamashuach b'shemen hamishcha o hamerubeh b'ivgadim. Whether it's a Kohen Gadol who is anointed with the anointing oil that's described in Parshat Kitisa as a matter of fact, coincidentally, or even if he wasn't anointed, but he had the many, that is the 8 pieces of clothing that were particular to the Kohen Gadol, which was the situation in Bayit Sheni. Shabbat, if it was Shabbat, in other words, if Yom Kippur fell out on Shabbat, Af Musaf Shabbat ein makriv oto el Kohen Gadol. Also, then we'd have to bring the Musaf of Shabbat, and that would also have to be done by the Kohen Gadol. And also the other services that had to be done on this day, Kigon, Haktarat Haktoret, Shel Yom, like bringing the incense that was done every day, not just the incense that was brought into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but the incense that's brought every day on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, on the golden Mizbeach, and Hatavat HaNeirot, and taking care of the lamps of the menorah. Akol Asui b'Kohen Gadol Nasui. All of those are done by a married Kohen Gadol, and then he brings the proof text for why he has to be married, because it says V'chiper ba'ado u'va'ad beito, because the Kohen Gadol will atone for himself and for his house. Beito zo ishto. What does it mean, his house? It means his wife. Okay, so this is the Rambam essentially this is his introduction to these halachot of Yom Kippurim. He's going to take beginning basically chapters 2 and 3. He's going to go through and describe these avodot. In chapter 4, which we've looked at parts of before, but if you want to see it, chapter 4, he goes through the whole day. In other words, he puts all things together. He leaves out a lot of the details that he put in chapter 2 and 3, but in chapter 4, he goes through from the beginning of the day till the end of the day, which is what we've been trying to learn now by going through all these chapters of Yoma. So the Rambam, of course, is very good about that. But for our purposes for today, I want to at least start on understanding the Mishnah that we were learning before, and to look at the Gemara on that Mishnah. So last week we went through the Mishnah. I think we've read through the Mishnah a couple of times, and we read through the Bar Tanura last time, but it was also a somewhat cursory reading. So I decided on balance, we'll learn the Gemara, even though the Gemara itself is not that easy, but I think once we learn it, then we'll be able to understand the Mishnah better, and we'll be able to understand the comments of the Bar Tanura on the Mishnah better. Okay, so let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Here we go. So this is from the Gemara in Yoma. second. This is the Gemara in Yoma on Daf Ayin Amud Aleph. We're going to spill over to Ayin Amud Bet. So it begins with the Mishnah that we saw. It says, "Im bevigdei butz korei, kidesh yadav raglav, pashat irad v'taval, alav anistapeg, v'heviu lo bigdei zahav v'lavash, v'kidesh yadav raglav, v'yatzav asad elov et el ha'am." So if he had read in the white clothing, in the white linen clothing that he has to wear to do the avodah inside of the Kodesh, in the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, that is, the Kohen Gadol in the Mishnah prior had read from the Torah while the par and the seir hanisrafim, right, the ox and the goat that have to be burnt are being burnt outside of Yerushalayim. So he read the Torah, and now if he was, we said that he had the option of either reading in the Bigdei Lavan, which he was already wearing, or if he wanted, he could take those off and wear his own piece of clothing while he was reading. But if he had been reading in the Bigdei boots, now he has to come and do the next set of avodot, the next set of korbanot. So he's going to have to wear the Bigdei Zahav for this. He has to wear his regular everyday Kohen Gadol clothing. So if he was wearing the Bigdei boots when he was reading, at this point, he will now wash his hands and legs, and he will strip, and he'll go down and tavel, and then he'll get up and dry off, and they'll bring him the Bigdei Zahav, the golden clothing that he wears is the Kohen Gadol, the lavash, he'll put them on, and then V'kidesh yadav v'raglav, and he will wash his hands and feet again, as we've mentioned several times, that when he changed his clothing, he had to wash his hands and feet before he changed and then after he changed, right? So he washes his hands and feet and then gets undressed and then towels and then dries off. He gets dressed, he washes his hands and feet again. Okay. And then he goes out, v'asa et elo ve'et el ha'am. He does his ram and the ram of the people. So again, in Achremot, it says that the Kohen Gadol had to bring, in addition to a par, he had to bring an ayil, so that's his ram. And for the people, they had to bring two seirim lechatat. One was Azazel and one was Hashem. That's the seir nasa bifnim, and they also had to bring an ayil. So at this point, he's going to do his ayil and the people's ayil. But shivat kvasim tamimim b'nei shana, and also the 7 sheep, the 7 unblemished sheep that are a year old. And so we know that the shivat kvasim, those are among the korbanot musaf that are mentioned in Parshat Pinchas. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. This is Rabbi Eliezer's. These are Rabbi Eliezer's words. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevim. They were brought with the Korban Tamid of the morning. Presumably, what does Rabbi Akiva seem to mean when he says they? They were brought. What was brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar?
The mincha and the libations.
We didn't mention those at all.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm drifting.
That's okay, but you tried. But what did Rabbi Eliezer just talk about? What did Rabbi Eliezer say is brought at this point?
The 2 ayalim as well as the sheep. But I don't know if he was referring to all 3 or just the ayalim.
Okay, so that's fine. That should be your answer. Or that, I'm going to take that as your answer. In other words, when Rabbi Akiva says, Im tamid shel shachar hayu krevin, they were brought with tamid shel shachar. So we want to know, what does Rabbi Akiva mean? Does he mean that the 7 sheep were brought with the tamid shel shachar, but the elim are being brought now? And he agrees with Rabbi Eliezer that they're being brought now. Or does he mean that the elim, the rams and the sheep, were all brought with the tamid shel shachar? And of course, the tamid shel shachar he did at the beginning of the day. He did that much earlier. So this is already a question. We're not sure exactly what Rabbi Akiva is referring to when he says Im tamid shel shachar yukrevin. But then he goes on and says Ufar ha'olah b'seir hanaseh b'chutz hayukrevin im tamid shel ben ha'arbayim. So I think we mentioned this last time that this is a question. So first of all, what does it mean? That the par ha'olah, so what was the par ha'olah? The par ha'olah was one of the korbanot musaf. There was a par that's a chatat that the Kohen Gadol brings. He brings a par on his behalf and on behalf of the Kohanim, the chatat, and that's burnt outside. That's the par ha'misraf. And he has to bring an ayil. But in Parshat Pinchas, we know in the Musafim, there's a par that's brought as a korban musaf, that's brought as an olah. So par ha'olah and sir hanaseh b'chutz, which we explained is also one of the korbanot musaf. It's a chatat that's done as a regular chatat on the outside mizbeach, and it's eaten in the evening. Hayu krevin in tamid shel ben ha'arbayim. Those were brought with the tamid of the evening. Kidesh yadav raglav upashat v'yarad v'taval. So when he finishes those korbanot, presumably through the end of the tamid shel ben ha'arbayim, which is the last korban that he has to bring, then once again he's going to wash his hands and legs. He's going to strip. He'll go down and towel. He'll get up. He'll get up and he'll dry off. Bigdei lavan. Then they'll bring him the bigdei lavan. He'll bring him the white linen clothing to do the last thing that he needs to do. I'm sorry, what I said a moment ago is not correct. He has not yet done all the korbanot of the day. He has to, but after he's brought the korbanot that he needs to bring. So, meaning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, after he brought the elim and the shivat kvasim, and Rabbi Akiva, it's not 100% clear exactly what he means. But after he's brought those, then he's going to wash and strip and change into the bigdei lavan and wash again. And then he's going to nichnas he goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim for the last time to retrieve the censer and the coal pan. Kidesh yadav raglav, he'll come out, he's going to wash his hands and legs, he's going to strip down and tavel again, he'll get up, and they'll bring him the bigdei zahav, he'll bring him his regular Kohen Gadol clothing, and then he'll wash his hands and legs again, and then he'll go in to bring the incense for the evening, and to fix the neirot on the menorah. Then v'kidesh yadav ragav pashat. Then he's going to wash his hands and legs, and he's going to strip. We're going to skip the words that are in the parentheses. Hevilo bigdei atzmo v'lavash. And then they'll bring him his own clothing, and he'll get dressed because he's now finished all of his work for the day as Kohen Gadol. He's still Kohen Gadol, but he's finished his work. Lavinato ad beito, and they will accompany him up to his house. Yom Tov hayasa usel alav, they would have a celebration for his friends. B'sha'ashi yatzah b'shalom min hakodesh, at this time that he's gone out in peace from the holy, from the Beit HaMikdash, from the Holy of Holies. Okay.
Shel?
Yes.
In the Seder Avodah, which you read on Yom Kippur, is it according to Rabbi Akiva or according to Rabbi Eliezer?
I believe we go according to Rabbi Akiva. I didn't check that. Halacha in this case is like Rabbi Akiva. And so I'm pretty sure that the Paitan does the Seder HaAvodah according to Rabbi Akiva. And but exactly what the Seder is, we're still not clear, right? Because we're not clear on exactly what Rabbi Akiva, what exactly he means. And we still haven't really accounted for all of the korbanot, right? Which is one of the reasons I listed them at the beginning. But instead of going through it again there, let's look now in the Gemara, because the Gemara is going to ask a series of questions that will illuminate the problems that we're dealing with.
So the piyut goes according to a very specific interpretation. The piyut will.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, it's interesting because, you know, the Paitanim were, of course, often great Talmidei Chachamim unto themselves. And they're sometimes cited as sources for halacha.
And there are two piyutim on Yom Kippur. Some people use one and some people use the other.
Yes, and I think that there actually I think there were more historically. But like nowadays, they're different. Like basically two minhakim. But I have the critical edition of the Machzorim. I don't have it with me because I'm not in Israel, but I believe there he brings other versions, if I remember correctly. So, okay. So Ibailuhu, so they asked them, in other words, now this is the Gemara. So the Gemara is asking this question in the Beis HaMedrash. Hechi ka'amar, how is he saying? And as Rashi explains, in other words, what they're asking is, what exactly is Rabbi Akiva saying? Im tamid shel shachar hayu krevin, they were brought with the tamid shel shachar, Ufar ha'ola usir naseh b'chutz im tamid shel ben ha'arbaim. In other words, when I read Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says im tamid shel shachar hayu krevin, and then he says Upar ha'ola usir naseh b'chutz hayu krevin im tamid shel ben ha'arbaim. So do we read it the way I read it now as one of the readings in the Mishnah, that Yim Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevin refers back to the things that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about. Those were brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar, and then Par Ha'olah and Sir HaNaseh B'chutz were brought with the Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbaim. O Dilma Hachikamar, perhaps it's read like this: Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevin, Upar Ha'olah B'hadayu. Maybe he means the things that Rabbi Eliezer says are brought now were brought with the Tamid Shachar, and Par Ha'olah, which was one of the Musafim, was brought with them as part of what was brought in the morning. Usir HaNaseh B'chutz im Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbaim. And the Sir HaNaseh B'chutz, the Sir Chatat of the Musaf, that was brought with the Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbaim. So that's one question. When I read the Mishnah and I see these words, in Tamid Shel, Rabbi Akiva says, in Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevin Ufar Ha'olah, do I read it? In other words, I've laid the page out according to the first reading. Im tamid shachar yukrevin, that refers back to what Rabbi Eliezer was talking about. And then new halacha. Par ha'olah osir naseh b'chutz, those were brought with bein ha'arbaim. Or I could have laid it out like this. I could have read it like this. I could have read Im tamid shel shachar yukrevin ufar ha'olah. In other words, that Rabbi Akiva says the musafim that are mentioned by Rabbi Eliezer, those were brought with the tamid shel shachar along with par ha'olah, which was also a musaf. And Sira Naseh B'chutz, that was brought with the tamid shel bein arbaim. Now, what it indicates against that in the girsa that we have in the Mishnah is these words here, hayu krevin, they were brought. According to this second reading, there was only one thing that was brought along with the tamid shel bein arbaim. That was the Sira Naseh B'chutz. But nonetheless, this is the way the Gemara is asking the question. Is the par, in other words, they're asking it, is the par ha'olah, which is one of the korbanot musaf, does Rabbi Akiva hold that was brought in the morning along with the other parts of the korban musaf, or was it brought in the evening along with the tamid shel bein ha'arbaim? The one, I think we explained this last time, but maybe let's just hold on a second. Okay, I have this open. Yeah. Now that we know that we have at least 15 korbanot to keep in mind, I'm trying to, I keep repeating certain things because I'm trying to keep everything straight. So in Parshat Pinchas, I just want to clarify this. We did this last week. Let's just clarify this again. The Korban Musaf, as described in Parshat Pinchas, goes like this. Hikravtem Olal Hashem, right? This is Parshat Pinchas, it's Bamidbar Perek Chavtet, and I'm reading from Pasuk Chet. You bring an Olah, which is a Par Ben Bakar Echad, that's the Par Olah that we're talking about now. Ayil Echad, that's the Ayil of the Kohen, that's the Ayil of the Am that's mentioned in Parshat Achremot according to the Rambam, and that's for the moment, that's the Shita that we're going to use. And Kvasim B'nai Shna Shivat Minim Yu Lachem. So these things were all brought as an Olah, as part of the Korban Musaf. The Par, the Ayil, and the seven Kvasim. And then in addition, there was one more Korban Musaf, and that's said a few psukim later, Sir Yizim Echad Chatat. So the Sir Yizim Echad Chatat, the way it's brought in the psukim, it's not grouped together with the olot. We have the olot, the par, the ayil, and the kvasim, and then we also have the sir chatat. And for reasons that we'll get into now in this sugya, the sir chatat, which is the sir hanaseh b'chutz, that was, everybody seems to understand that's done later. But the question is, what about the olot? Are they all brought together? And when are they brought? Are they brought in the morning with the Korban Tamid, after the Korban Tamid? Or are they brought later on in the day, after, as it's brought down in our Mishnah, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that actually those things would be brought after the Torah reading, right? Which is already after, it's after the Tamid, and it's also after all of the Avodah that's done with the Par and the Seir and the blood that was sprinkled inside of the Beit HaMikdash and the sending of the Seir L'Azazel. So it's done much later in the day. That's the essential machloket. And now the Gemara is asking in particular about the Par. Did Rabbi Akiva, when Rabbi Akiva says that essentially that the korbanot, that these olot of the musaf are brought with the tamid shel shachar, did he mean to include also the par ha'olah, that was also brought with the tamid shel shachar? And that would make sense because we see that the olot of the musaf are all grouped together. According to the simple reading of Rabbi Akiva, he's saying to Rabbi Yezer, no, those things were brought in the morning. So what were those things? The Elim and the Shivat HaKvasim. So he's saying, no, those things were brought in the morning, and according to one reading, along with the Par HaOlah. In other words, all of the olot would be brought together, all the olot of Musaf would be brought together after Tamid Shel Shachar. So that's the question, that's the first question that's being posed in the Gemara. So that's one question. Vitu, and further, Par ha'olah l'Rebbe Eliezer d'shayareh, emat avidle. What about Rebbe Eliezer? Rebbe Eliezer left out the Par ha'olah. He doesn't mention it at all. So according to Rebbe Eliezer, when was this Par ha'olah? When was this brought? Vitu, and further, Bein Rebbe Eliezer, Bein Rebbe Akiva, Emurei Chatat, Emat Avidlahu. And according to Rebbe Eliezer and according to Rebbe Akiva, when would they do the Emurim, right? This is why I gave a little introduction to Emurim, these inner parts of the Chatat, when were those brought? So those are the basic questions that the Gemara starts off with. Let's look at Rashi on these questions. And I think that's where I'm going to leave the shir for this week. I'll leave it as a cliffhanger. Ibayalahu, right? So they asked this as a question. Rashi says Rabbi Akiva. How do we understand reading Rabbi Akiva? Im tamid shachar yukrevin upar ha'olah. Okay. Bitu. Right, and then we ask further. Par ha'olah Rabbi Yezer d'shayarei emat avidle. The par ha'olah that Rabbi Eliezer left out, he left it on the side. When did he do it? So Rashi says, to par ha'olah Rabbi Eliezer d'shayarei v'lo ayri be. In other words, he left it and he didn't speak about it. He doesn't mention par ha'olah at all, Rabbi Eliezer. Emat avidle. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, when would the Kohen Gadol have brought the par ha'olah? V'hu adinami di'ika l'kshuya as-seir. He could have asked the same question about the seir, meaning the seir chatat, el reish milta nakat, but he just brings up the first thing. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer left out two korbanot. We don't know when he thinks. We don't know when he thinks that the Kohen Gadol should bring the par ha'olah, that part of the musaf, and also the seir chatat, which is the seir hanaseh b'chutz. We also don't know when he thinks that should be done. Further, whether according to Rabbi Eliezer or according to Rabbi Akiva, emurei chatat emat avidlu. When would they do the emurei chatat? Rashi says, "Ditana b'idach pirkan natnam b'magas ad she'at tiren." We learned elsewhere. We'll learn it later on in the parak, that he puts the emurim into a magas, into a kind of a vessel, until he brings them to be burnt on the mizbeach. So when exactly were they burnt on the mizbeach? So those are our questions. And, oops, I think as much as I would like to go forward, I think I'm going to stop here for now because it's a lot to digest. And if I start into the Gemara's answers, we will be left off really in the middle of something else. So I think it's better to be left off with our questions hanging. So I think we'll stop here. But does anybody want to add or ask any last questions before we go on? No. Okay. All right, so Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll tackle this sugya. I'm almost finished laying it out, so I'll try to send it to you in advance if you want to look, or you can, of course, look at if you have it at home, the sugya, or you can look online if you want to see English translation with Steinsaltz and all of that. You're welcome to do that. And we'll look at it as best as we can next week and try to put this together. And if all goes well, my chart that I started to show you last week, I'm still working on. I'm going to work in all of the korbanot and all of the times that he has to wash and go to the mikvah and all of that. I'm trying to make it an orderly chart that hopefully the visual, as Michael alluded to at the beginning of this year, will be helpful. Okay, have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
D'accord.